the Today I'm representing the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. They are, I guess that doesn't work. We'll do it this way.
Yeah, they should work. Okay.
Okay, now. Okay, the Xerces, I think we want to go back a little bit. Okay. The reason they call themselves the Xerces Society is they named themselves for the first butterfly in North America known to become extinct from the actions of man. It was a blue butterfly found in California. And their focus, they have multi-purpose focuses. The society, they work on habitat creation, pesticide reduction, species protection, and research. I want to tell you, they have representatives in much of the United States at this point. I think there's now around 100 staff in 25 states. Okay, pollination 101. 85% of flowering plants require a pollinator to move pollen to fertilize their flowers. Now, that pollinator, the ones that don't use animals use either the wind or there's a few that use water, but most of them need animals, and most of those are insects. And in insects, the primary ones are bees. 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food and drink we consume is, produced by pollination, and $30 billion worth of crops in North America. And of course, insects support other forms of life. The fruits and the seeds are a major part of the diet of many animals, and sometimes pollinators are food. In fact, they say that in order for a bird to, produce one batch of nestlings, it may require as many as like 500 caterpillars to feed that one cohort. So we need a lot of invertebrates. Now, these are some of the different groups of insect pollinators. In this part of the world, insect pollinators are probably your primary pollinators. In some parts of the world, butterflies and hummingbirds, and there are even some reptiles that are pollinators on island habitats. But here we're mostly talking insects. And what you see here are butterflies, moths, you're seeing beetles, wasps, and bees. And there's a fly there. So those are some of our major pollinators. But among them, bees are really most critical. And one of the reasons is they require food from flowers at all stages of their life cycle. Butterflies and flies and beetles, they may pollinate when they're adults, but their young are not pollinator, not eating pollen and nectar. So the bees need it for feeding their young and feeding themselves. So that's one of the reasons they're so critical for pollination. Now, how you transport pollen actually can help you figure out what kind of bees you got. Some of them have these pollen baskets, and some of them have the pollen brushes. The pollen baskets tend to be, bumblebees and honeybees. And then some things look like bees, but are not bees. If you're trying to tell the difference between a bee and a wasp, some of the ways you tell is wasps tend to have that narrowing in their body. And they don't have any structure for actually carrying the pollen. Now, some of the flies really kind of look like bees. And I think part of the reason they do that is so that they can mimic bees and are less likely to get attacked by other things thinking that they're a bee. So one way you can tell is the bees will have 2 pairs of wings. Flies only have 1 pair. So that's one way to tell. We have a lot of native bees. Most of them are solitary. Most of them are gentle and unlikely to sting. The bees are more likely to sting when they're protecting a colony, when they're trying to, with that, if they're by themselves, they're not as inclined to sting. Now, a lot of times when people get stung, what they get stung by, thinking it's a bee, is a yellow jacket, which is actually a wasp. And again, they're defending a nest, and that's when they're usually most aggressive. I've had that happen when I'm pulling weeds, because they tend to be ground nesters. There are a lot of bees. In the US, over 3,600. In Virginia, I think 456 have been identified. In Maryland, 400. DC, nearly 200. So there's a lot of bees out there, different kinds. And bees come in lots of sizes. I think this is pretty cool. This one is the biggest bee and the littlest bee found in North America. So you can get kind of an idea of the diversity in size. The little Perdita bee is so little that you could probably fit it in like an O of a type. It is so tiny. How big is the big one? Let me see. I have my notes. I can answer that in a second. I know someone was going to ask that. Let's see. Okay, the biggest one is 1.25 inches. And yeah, that's a valley carpenter bee. Carpenter bees tend to be among the biggest bees. Those and the female bumblebees tend to be the biggest bees. And this is just a little bit showing you the beauty and the diversity of bees. This one is they can come in all colors. I kind of like these metallic green sweat bees. They really are pretty. And another little, just tiny little bees, long-haired bees, leaf-cutter bees, a nocturnal bee. One of the things that's interesting about a nocturnal bee is bees have a number of eyes. They have their big eyes that, like we see, but they have the little eyes up on the top of their head that are sensitive to light. And this one has particularly big ones. They call them ocelli because it's a bee that's active at night. So it needs extra light.
Is that one predaceous? I'm looking at those mandibles. They're not formidable.
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't know of any that are predaceous. They are going to be using nectar and pollen as their source of food. And this one has kind of an interesting thing, it has a really long proboscis. It's good for, they come in different lengths, the tongues, and they can, the longer ones can reach those deeper flowers, and, ones with shorter tongues can only reach, flowers that are not as, that are more flat, not as deep. Now, it is just amazing. This is just to get you a feeling for how many different kinds of bees there are out there. This slide and the second one, they're just at kind of the large grouping because there's multiple bees within each of these groups, but they're showing you bumblebees, mining bees, metallic sweat bees, small sweat bees, furrow bees, sunflower bees, longhorn bees, small copper bees, leafcutter bees, mason bees, squash bees, nomada bees, polyester bees, yellow-faced bees, digger bees, and wool carder bees. So there are just a lot of bees out there. And these are big groups that include more species within them. A lot of them are generalists. Some of them are very specific, like the squash bee. I'm always wishing I could get some squash bees in my yard because I seem to always plant these vines and they never get pollinated. And I think I really could use some squash bees, but they're squash experts and not generalists. Okay, well, here's your bee. So many of the bees, they like to live underground. And this just gives you a general idea. This is looking at a mining bee, how it spends its year. Female works to create a nest. They build and supply brood cells. They lay their eggs and seal the brood cell. The larva eats the food supply that it's, put in there for its babies, and then spends most of the year as a pupa and then emerges. About 70% of native bee species are ground nesting. And they may look like ant nests when you see them in the ground, but if you, pay close attention and see who's coming out. So it is actually good to leave a little bit sandy, bare ground for their nests. And then another group of bees are tunnel nesting. And this is a reason to leave some dead twigs and branches. They may use old twigs to put their eggs in. And they may use different kinds of materials for resin, soil, various leaves. One thing, I think there's some pictures later on. One way you can know if there's a leaf cutter bees around is if you find plants that have these almost perfect little circles in them cut out, that's probably the work of a leaf cutter bee because they like to take, certain leaves and make these little pretty circles, and they use them to put divisions in their nests. Now, a bumblebee is a colony nester. It's one of the few that is, but they're different than like honeybees in that their life cycle tends to be 1 year. In the winter, a queen hibernates, and the first bumblebees you see in the spring are going to be the queens. They come out, they start working, getting some food, establish a nest, lay some eggs, and once they have some workers, they don't go foraging anymore. But they're the one that survives the winter, and it's like a 1 year cycle. And it's the mated queens that overwinter. with the founding queen dying. So that's how bumblebees work it.
Are bumblebees as good a pollinator as honeybees?
Yes, yes, in many ways. Well, they're also, they have an ability that honeybees don't have, which is called buzz pollination, that carpenter bees and bumblebees have, which when they pollinate, they shake the flower, which is good for certain kinds of pollination, like tomatoes. It kind of releases the pollen. So yeah, they are very effective. Bees need untidy areas. You know, we were talking about the dirt, plain dirt is good for them. Also, rodent holes are great for bumblebees because bumblebees don't usually make a hole in the ground. They usually seek out some other hole that exists. They're mostly ground nesters. Sometimes they will nest above ground, bumblebees. And they also can provide winter shelter for other insects. And these are the same bees I showed you before, just giving you a feeling for how many of them are ground nesters and how many are more like tunnel or, you know, tubular nesters. So a lot of grounds. And of course, obviously bees need flowers. Native plants are generally better for native bees. And the threats. Okay, well, one is just loss of habitat. This is pretty much a wasteland for anything, for nesting, for food. And so much of our land is this. And then another issue can be pesticides. Now, this is an example of, those are all dead bumblebees. This photo was taken after some trees in Portland were sprayed, and it was done legally, but the pesticides got through the sap into the flowers, killing about 50,000 bumblebees. So they were applied legally. The good news is they no longer use those pesticides in Portland. Sometimes we think about pesticides as being used in agricultural areas, but you know, they're also used in many gardens and other areas, sometimes for cosmetic reasons. And we're talking pesticides, we're talking, it's a generic term for, you know, fungicides, herbicides, insecticides, rodenticides, all those different things. So if you can tolerate a little bit of damage, it could mean that something is living, you know, that maybe perfection can be the enemy of the good if the only reason you're spraying is because things are just a little damaged. And of course, another issue for wildlife in general, for us as well, is climate change, which can change habitats either through burning or drought, making it hard to survive. Bumblebees, some of the research shows, are very directly affected by heat that can, you know, make it difficult for them. And that's, and actually they're one of the bees that sometimes can be found at higher elevations and, you know, further north because they can tolerate cold better, but not heat.
Is that an issue with migration of the pollinators? You mentioned the bumblebees and the heat. Do they go further north with climate change?
They might if they can find ways to get there, yeah. I don't know how much migration they do, you know, like a bumblebee, whether it's, you know, very gradual, because, you know, some things don't move a lot, and the rate at which we're changing things. Someone was telling me that our vegetation zones are now 8 around here, which wasn't that long ago, they were 6, you know? It can be hard for things to move that fast.
Well, I was thinking that, when the soil is really cold, past winter time, of course, the same period of time, various insects, including pollinators, are affected by it. So one year you had a lot of insects that survive the cold, and others were killed off because of the harshness of the weather. So, you know, I would think that they would move it in one direction or the other, or your ability to.
Yeah, they may. I mean, there is some ability for wildlife to adapt to change. How much is the question, how fast? I mean, sometimes there are, you know, positive stories of adaptability, you know, finding ways to cope with the changes in heat and stuff.
You mentioned climate change. What can you do with climate change? You know, in an environment where, you know, we're here and the climate has changed, you know, 2 degrees, like half a degree, and pollinators are disappearing.
Well, you know, it's one more stress for certain things. I mean, they can go underground, you know, that's part of the way you cope with the heat. So a bee might, for example, try to forage early in the morning and late at night, you know, when it's really hot, which might mean that it can survive, but maybe not reproduce as much. You know, if it doesn't get as much nutrients, because it has to find a way to cope. I mean, in desert environments, a lot of the animals are most active at night because, you know, the heat is tolerable. So yeah, that could be one coping mechanism, but it may not. It may mean another reason to help them, because they may need to really eat a lot first thing in the morning and at dusk to survive. Okay, so they need what bees need for conservation is help during the entire life cycle. Flowers for foraging, secure nest sites, pesticide-free environment, to protect existing areas and perhaps create some new ones. You know, natural areas are often the foundation of conservation of species and ecosystems, but there's a lot that can be done in our neighborhoods. You know, bees can move around, and, you know, if everybody has a good patch, there might be enough food for them to survive. And, you know, if we have somebody in the neighborhood has some nice bare soil and somebody has some nice sticks, you know, so it is a community can help bees thrive. And bees connect us. I don't think this shows up very well, but the concept here was just basically showing the area that, you know, the bees are going to be moving over a landscape. You know, you can do some things on your own plot, and I encourage you to do that, but it also helps if more people are doing it on the landscape, because they are going to be moving around. So what you need, a mixture of flowers for season-long bloom. If you could have like at least maybe 3 different kinds of flowers blooming at any given time in a growing season, and a variety of flowers. We learned that some of the bees have the short tongues and some have the long tongues, and that can be true of other pollinating insects as well. So, a mix of the deeper flowers and flowers that are more open, again, can benefit a greater diversity of wildlife. And, shrubs and trees are also a good source of flowers, not just, that with being azaleas society, but, trees, if there's been a lot of research about how many different kinds of insects can live in trees. And often some of the flowering trees are some of the first things to bloom in the spring. So, can provide a good food source for our pollinators. Beekeeping is not bee conservation. This is something we kind of like to address. Honeybees are kind of like domesticated animals. They originated in Europe. If you want to keep them, there are good reasons for keeping them, but it's not going to necessarily help native pollinators. And in fact, there can be reasons if you have too many hives and not enough flowers that you can make it difficult for the native bees to survive. And also, if you're managing hives, you want to make sure that you keep them disease-free so that they don't spread disease to other native bees, because that can be an issue as well. So yeah, if you're going to have beehives, make sure you plant a lot of flowers for one thing, because they will use a lot of the floral resources. They're very efficient at doing that. And because they're, again, they have a long season. They often have a lot of bees in those hives too. So there's a lot of bees that they're supporting in each hive. Grow pollen-friendly flowers. One thing is some flowers, especially when you have like the double flowers and such, some of the commercial varieties actually don't have much in the way of food resources for plants, for animals. So, when they do all this breeding, they may breed out the pollen and nectar sources. So that's something. Old-fashioned flowers and native flowers are more likely to provide food resources for your bees and other pollinators. Okay, choosing plants, of course, these things, but you choose some of them because you like them. And it's important for the bees' diversity. And we talked about the bloom period. Make sure you have some that bloom early and bloom late. Late is really good for some of the non-bees, like the things that migrate, monarchs, and some of the other butterflies that are going to be migrating really need to store up some energy before they take flight. So those late blooming flowers are very important. Things like goldenrod or boneset. And native is best. We've got a lot of beautiful native flowers. These are ones, actually I took these photos, just ones I've had in my garden. Trilliums. We've got partridge pea, blue-eyed stem grass, golden Alexander. And butterfly weed, mist flower, common milkweed, and boneset. And they do bring on the bees and the butterflies. And of course, I had to add some slides for this organization. 18 species of native azaleas in North America. And Virginia is home to 8. So that's a pretty good, we have quite a lot of them here in Virginia. All are deciduous, fragrant, have protruding stamens, and all benefit bumblebees. And of course, when you're choosing plants, you might also think about those butterflies and moths too. Sometimes they have very specific plants that caterpillars need to eat at that stage in their life cycle. And this is a spice bush caterpillar on a spice bush. He's got those pretend eyes. The pretend eyes are a way to make you look like you're something bigger and more dangerous, you know. And non-native plants are okay in formal landscapes when chosen carefully. These are a couple that my daughter took pictures of. But yeah, the bumblebees do like them. And as I was mentioning, you know, some of the cultivars, you know, just aren't really good food producers for pollinators. And lawns, of course, they have little or no habitat value, a little, but not a lot. And you may have heard of no mow May. The concept was if they let the grass grow, flowers could bloom and provide forage for bees. Of course, you know, it depends where you live. No mowing May here would be, the grass would be too, you get in trouble with your neighbors. But the concept is leave the grass a little longer. It helps keep moisture in the soil. Maybe the few things could bloom if you don't have just grass like clover. So, you know, it's not like a big step forward, but it's a little step forward. Just that is the basic concept with no mow May. And it could just be a starting point for a conversation about, you know, why you would do this. Okay, and of course we talked about nest sites. There's a bee in its nest. And if you can, leave some snags, shrubs, bare ground. You know, again, depends where you live and, you know, whether or not that's an option. Things like snags are often good for birds too, for nesting, if you can. It's not a safety risk. And again, the bees need the access to soil. You can make some artificial things for those tube nesters. But you do need to maintain them. Otherwise, if, you know, too many bees in one location, and if you don't clean it out annually, you could end up, you know, making it a place where disease spreads among bees. And you might want, if you were doing it yourself, you know, do various sizes for the various size bees that might want to use a tunnel nester. And somebody asked me about this. I actually have one of these. It was given as a present. I think they say that about 1 in 5 actually gets colonized by a bee. I think I had one year. I think right now I have ants in mine. This is okay. I'm all right with the ants, but you know, it may work, but you know, low probability, still a possibility, because you do want to put it somewhere close to the ground, because they do like to be close to the ground, and as we talked about, they want to be cool too. So I would put it somewhere shaded, and so if you were trying to get bees. And I've got some publications in the back that show some of this stuff. Saving the stems. One of the things they suggest, Xerces suggests, is if you know, you have flower stalks in the spring. If you could leave just a little bit of the stem, especially ones that have hollow stems, and then let the natural growth kind of grow up around them. But, you know, the natural stems, if they're hollow, can be a good place for some of these stem-loving bees to, you know, to establish themselves. And they're suggesting cutting at different lengths. And these are some of the plants that stem nesting bees like. Hyssop, coneflower, sunflower, blazing star, bee balm, goldenrod, aster, raspberries, sumac, and elderberry. And again, as mentioned about the snakes. And if you can leave some leaves, it kind of helps maintain the moisture of the soil, leaving some leaves. And, you know, it's good for a lot of insects to have that cover. Yeah, so I mean, not just bees, but, you know, moths and butterflies and fireflies and ground beetles, you know, all kind of like that layer of leaves. But of course, you have to be careful where you leave the leaves. You can't block drains, you can't create slip hazards. And, you know, if you got a diseased plant, you don't want to leave the leaves of that. So, you know, just some guidelines. So here's some examples of places where leaves got left. Sometimes it helps to have a sign too, so you can explain why are you doing this. You know, so it makes people a little maybe think you're not just being lazy, but you're doing it for a purpose. And of course, needles are leaves too. So they can serve the same purpose in providing some habitat and some moisture retaining ability on the soil. And again, some branches can be useful. And things like hardscaping, rocks, you know, again, providing cavities for nesting. Oh, and their pesticide reduction, again, showing lots of dead bees. And if you do use them, try to minimize their use, read their guidance. But if they're effective killing things, they may be killing your pollinators too. Just be aware of that. Most things are not, if they are like insecticides, they're not really that specific to one, you know, the pest, you know, if they're going to be effective, they're going to probably kill other things as well. And you may want to ask the question, when you're buying plants, have they been pre-treated? Because a lot of times you don't know that until you ask. Or if you know that the nursery or plant source doesn't pre-treat them with things like neonicotinoids. And neonicotinoids have been shown to be an issue with bees for both honeybees and bumblebees, and whether or not they are for other bees, probably, but less is known about those. They're less studied. So ask if they carry it.
Is the industry required to put that on the label of the plant?
I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. I mean, but you know, you can ask, and there are places where and if they don't know, that's not a good sign. So, they should know one way or the other, whether the seeds have been pre-treated or the plants have been pre-treated.
How long does that last?
Long.
Long.
That's the issue. They suggest months or years. So that is I mean, if you buy organic, then you know it's not done. But even some other places that are not organic have gone away from using neonicotinoids.
So they are banning them.
Yeah.
So homes cannot get neonics. I can, but I'm licensed, and I'm able to do it. Not using. But organic does not mean pesticide free people. Organic does not mean pesticide free them. Hydrochlorics means the horticultural oils are used on organic farms. So you have to do your homework.
They consider pyrethrins organic? Ugh. Yeah.
There's a bunch that.
Yeah, I know that they're kind of derived from plant-based sources, but they're still very toxic. Yeah. Okay, but yeah, you can ask. I mean, I asked Monticello, because I get some plants from there, and they said they didn't. Which I was, they gave me an answer, which I like to have. But yeah, it's interesting that they don't consider pyrethrins. I would have thought they would.
Or bok choy or magnesium. Pesticides have been used on that plant, they're low residual, and that's the difference.
Well, I mean, a lot of times it's because the soil has been, you know, like I grew up on an apple orchard. The soil has got residual pesticides for a long time. Yeah.
Not today. My boss is a pomologist, so
Yeah.
I work with apples.
Yeah.
And no, it's Jim. Well, herbicides, yes.
Yeah.
Herbicides, but pesticide, insecticides, fungicides.
Okay. Well, anyway, ask the question. What has been used on it? See if they know. And, you know, one of the reasons for producing a more natural habitat is you can get things a little more in balance too. And you probably will be providing habitat for some of the predators and parasitoids to keep things kind of, you know, in balance. That's what you're looking for. You know, you don't want things to get out of balance. And I was talking about the leafcutter ant or leafcutter bees. Those are those cute little circles they make. So that's a sign of a leafcutter. And of course, you know, below a caterpillar, sometimes a way to find a caterpillar is see where they've been munching. And other things you can do. You know, these are some of the Xerces things, pollinator pledges, and they have sponsored these bee cities. And there are some in our area, but not a lot. And they have to come up with kind of initiatives for how they're helping bees. I don't know if we have any educators here, but even if you just wanted to share it with, you know, children in your family, there's some activities for teaching about invertebrates. And for those who like to do community science, which is, you know, working as a volunteer to help collect information, so scientists and decision makers have more information to work with. There are a number of programs that include the Bumblebee Watch. There's a Bumblebee Atlas. Obviously, the Western Monarch is going to help us. But these other organizations, these aren't Xerces, but, you know, they're also looking at migration is turning north, looking at migration of insects, and, you know, some other projects that are paying attention to invertebrates. And Xerces has some wonderful books and lots of pamphlets. The pamphlets are usually free, so a lot of them are downloadable. I brought some. The books do cost a little bit, but they're very nice. And there's a podcast for those who like podcasts. And they have lots of webinars, that anybody can listen to. And then they usually put them in a library on YouTube, afterwards. So there's a lot of resources there. And of course, another thing you could do is join Xerces if you're interested. That's how I started out, just joining, and then I decided to go the route of being an ambassador. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about pollinators, one of my favorite subjects. So if any additional questions, I'm open for that. Yes.
I don't know where I heard this, but I've heard that, don't rinse your leaves until you've got 3 days of 50-degree weather or better. And it seems from this, that's a good idea, but even better is not to rake them at all. Is that true?
Well, you have to rake a little bit. If you live in a suburban area, but to rake, you don't need to rake them all. And again, if you could leave, sometimes, put them into a bunch of the shrubs or places where it's okay to leave them, that's good for all sorts of insects.
Sure.
And, there's a concern that insect populations in general are plummeting. And of course, that affects, that has like a multiplier effect because, bird populations are also plummeting. And, they need the insects in order to eat. So not only for the seed, but also for the insect life itself. So it is a concern. And it's a little thing we can all do. Just provide a little more habitat.
Reduce lawn.
Pardon me?
Reduce lawn.
Reduce lawns. Yes, reducing lawns. I think I have a statistic here. Let me find it if I can. About how, you could, if you could reduce lawns by a certain percentage. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't know, maybe I don't have it here. But yeah, it's boring. I keep trying, keep cutting back, letting my flower gardens kind of move out. Yeah. Yes.
Can you talk about no type services that come and spray landscapes? And a lot of my neighbors in Stone Park are like, well, he said it won't impact the weeds. And that he's using all natural, like garlic oil or whatever. And I'm like, if it's flying at that time, it's gonna be killed, obviously.
It affects, they're usually targeting mosquitoes.
Yeah.
If it kills other insects, it's gonna kill. If it's effective at all, it's gonna kill them. Or maybe not kill them, but maybe, sometimes low levels of pesticides don't actually lead to death, but lead to things like, some of the researchers show that they'll lose some of their ability to navigate, or, that's mostly with honeybees, but, they're more studied, that could be when they have this issue with honeybees, leaving their hive and stuff, that, some of it might have to do with pesticide. Yes.
And then in the habitat part, we didn't talk about water sources. I don't know, or maybe I missed it, but I know my little urban farm down the street from me, all their honey hives, they all come and line up on my rain barrel. And they're very polite for the leaves. And they're all waiting around for that sip, but they are dying for water, I think. There's just not enough water sources for, especially the native weeds too.
That's an interesting point. Wasn't in the original one, but I may add that, because I've seen I have a bird bath, just a really shallow one, and on my back porch, and And I've seen, wild sundays come and drink some of it.
What I usually do is I'll take a semi-fluent block and put it in the middle. So you've got shoreline, you've got different depths that anybody insect-wise can get as much or more water than out.
Yeah, I've got mine at a slant, so it's a little bit deeper at one end and then almost dry at the other end, so they can, because even birds, they say it's not good to make too deep because they can end up drowning. So, yeah,
You would appreciate something that I got to enjoy yesterday. There were two eastern comets, butterflies,
oh,
sparring. And they went over my roof of my house. They were way high on a tulip poplar, and I got to watch them. I guess it was a love dance. I'm assuming it was a love dance. But they were pretty cool. It's the first time I'd actually seen them get around like that. And then morning clothes zoomed by. I'm like, whoa, what is this with yesterday afternoon?
that was wonderful.
It's a butterfly.
Cool. I think morning floats, I think I was hearing, someone was talking about